Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
I knew they weren't coming even before I checked my phone that morning. There was no confirmation text, no rushed "we're on our way" message, not even a thumbs up emoji from my mom, which had somehow become her version of showing affection over the last few years. Still, for reasons I don't understand, I reached for my phone out of habit, maybe out of some dull, stupid hope, and opened Instagram. It was the first thing I saw: my brother, Kyle, standing on a perfectly trimmed golf course, smiling with his arm around my dad, both of them in their pastel polos, captioned "Proud of this guy today." A few frames later, there was my mom, clapping from the sidelines, sipping iced tea in those oversized sunglasses she only pulls out for events where she might be photographed. I stared at the screen for what must have been a full minute, not angry, not sad exactly, just hollow. Because the thing is, they didn't forget my graduation. They said they did, sure. They said the date slipped their minds. But they didn't forget his tournament. They never forget his tournaments. And I didn't say anything. Not then. Not when my stomach turned. Not even when I zipped up the black doctoral gown I bought myself, because I didn't want to bother them with expenses. I sat there in the dorm room I had never fully decorated, surrounded by years of solitary victories. Dusty certificates, untouched plaques, a shelf of textbooks heavier than the air between me and my parents. And let the silence ring. I didn't cry, I didn't call them, I didn't even text Kayla, though I knew she'd be mad if she found out I didn't let her come. It wasn't sadness that kept me quiet. It was the certainty, the kind that sets in like winter, that this wasn't a mistake. This was just them. This had always been them. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from being overlooked, not because you're not enough, but because someone else is always too much. Kyle was the sun, tanned, charismatic. He wasn't mean, not really, just loud, effortless. He was homecoming king, varsity everything, the kind of guy who got C's and still got praise because he kept the team together. When I won first place in the statewide science fair at 15, they said, "That's nice, honey," and changed the subject to Kyle's newest girlfriend. When I got into Columbia at 16, my dad said, "That's pretty far from home, you sure?" and then talked for 20 minutes about Kyle's college visits. And when I told them I'd been accepted into the accelerated PhD program, the youngest in my department's history, my mom said, "That's great. I should tell your aunt. She always brags about her daughter. Now we finally have something too." It was always like that. Never malicious, never cruel, just dismissive, indifferent. Like I was a puzzle they never really felt like finishing. I walked to the ceremony alone, the Capitol dome peeking out behind the gray clouds like it was watching too. The auditorium buzzed with families, parents holding balloons, cousins arguing about seating, people passing phones around to show off custom cakes, and group dinners planned after the event. I just kept my head down, held my cap in my hands, and reminded myself to breathe. I didn't need them there, I told myself. I'd made it this far without them, hadn't I? But if I'm honest, and I mean really honest, there was a part of me that still wanted it. Not for the photos, not for the likes, for the eye contact, for that 1 second when a parent locks eyes with their kid and you know they see you, really see you, and they feel something deeper than duty. Pride, recognition, that's what I never got. Not even a half-assed version. Not a "we're so proud of you" that felt like more than filler between stories about Kyle. When they called my name, I stepped onto the stage to a polite, scattered applause. No cheers, no whoops, no whistles from the back. Just silence behind me and a stiff smile from the dean. I held that diploma like it was made of glass and stared out into the audience. And that's when I noticed someone holding up a phone. A woman I didn't know. She was filming. Not just me, but the moment. Like it meant something. I looked at her and she smiled, nodding slightly, and for a second I felt visible. After the ceremony, I walked out alone. The sun was breaking through the clouds like it couldn't make up its mind. I stood near the fountains, watching other families crowd around their graduates, and checked my phone again. Nothing from Mom, nothing from Dad. I opened Instagram once more. Kyle was holding a trophy now. Another frame. My parents at dinner, steak and wine, smiling like it was Christmas. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. Have you ever done everything right, every damn thing they said you should do, and still felt like a ghost in your own story? Have you ever stood on the highest point of your life so far and realized the people you thought mattered most weren't even looking? That was me, but I didn't get angry. I didn't post about it. I didn't even tell Kayla what happened. I just went home, hung up the gown, placed the diploma next to the others, and waited. Not for them. No, I was done waiting for them. I was waiting for the world to find out. Because something else had happened that day. Something none of them knew yet. The woman with the phone, she wasn't just a guest. She was with the press. And tomorrow, her clip of me would go viral. They didn't show up for the ceremony, but soon, they'd see everything. And when they did, I wouldn't need to say a single word. The next morning arrived with a strange sort of stillness, the kind that wraps itself around your shoulders before your feet even touch the floor. Not heavy exactly, but dense enough that it changes the way you move, like you're walking through water instead of air. I sat in bed for a long time, not scrolling, not checking messages, not even looking at the diploma still resting on the desk chair, still in its black leather folder, like something fragile that hadn't quite settled into the reality it belonged to. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt loaded, like it was holding its breath, like the world was waiting for me to decide how I was going to feel about everything. But I wasn't ready to give it an answer yet. I hadn't spoken to anyone since the ceremony, hadn't posted anything, hadn't shared a single photo, because something inside me told me that this moment needed to live on its own for a little while longer, untouched by commentary or comparison, away from the exhausting charade of validation by likes. I wasn't even sure what I was supposed to feel. Was I proud, angry, vindicated, numb? The emotions were there, but they were layered so thickly over each other, like sediment on a riverbed, that I couldn't tell which one was sitting on top. It was almost noon when Kayla burst into my apartment without knocking, her voice already halfway into a sentence, before the door had fully opened, waving her phone in the air like it was on fire, her face split between excitement and confusion. Ellie, are you seriously going to pretend you're not all over the internet right now? What the hell? She shouted, tossing her bag onto the floor as she pulled up a video on her screen. And then I saw it. The clip, less than a minute long, grainy but clear enough to make out the colors, the faces, the significance. It was me, stepping onto the stage, the announcer's voice echoing in the background, saying my name, and then following it with a string of titles and honors that sounded surreal even hearing them a second time. The youngest PhD graduate in university history. The camera shook slightly as the woman filming adjusted her grip, and then, just for a second, the lens caught my face, solemn, composed, alone. Kayla didn't say anything for a few seconds after the video ended, just looked at me with her brows furrowed, like she was trying to decide if she should hug me or throw something. You didn't tell me. You didn't even let me come, she said finally, quieter now, hurt laced between the words like a thread she didn't want to pull too hard. I shrugged, not out of carelessness, but because I didn't have a proper answer that would make sense to someone who hadn't grown up needing to prove their worth, just to earn silence instead of attention. I wanted to do it by myself, I said, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't false either. It was the simplest version of a complicated truth. What I didn't know, and what Kayla had come to tell me, was that the clip had been picked up by a local news outlet's social media page, and from there, it had caught fire. The caption was clickbait gold. Silent genius, youngest PhD graduate walks stage alone, then this happens. And the comments were exploding. Thousands of strangers speculating about my story, praising the strength they imagined I had, filling in the blanks of my solitude with their own narratives of triumph, abandonment, and revenge. My inbox had started to fill up with requests, interviews, podcasts, profile pieces, my name, my face, my moment. Suddenly it wasn't just mine anymore. That's when I noticed the missed calls. It started with just one, then two, then a dozen, and when I finally scrolled down, I counted them. 37 in total. Most from my mother, a few from my father, one from Kyle, which surprised me more than anything else. The voicemail notifications blinked like tiny grenades waiting to go off. I didn't open them, not yet. I wasn't ready to hear their voices layered in afterthoughts, excuses wrapped in guilt, rehearsed concern pouring out only because now the world was watching. What would they say anyway? We're sorry we forgot? We didn't realize it was so important? Or maybe the more honest version, we didn't expect it to matter until everyone else noticed. That was the bitter truth. They didn't call because they missed me. They called because they missed the moment, and worse, because the moment didn't miss them. I had been seen. I had been recognized. And for once, they weren't the ones doing the recognizing. Later that night, I sat on the couch in the dark, the television off, Kayla asleep in the guest room, and I played one voicemail, just one. My mom's voice cracked halfway through her sentence, something she probably practiced 3 times before leaving it. Ellie, we saw the video. We didn't know. We didn't understand how big this was. We're so proud. Please call us. She sounded small, not weak, just uncertain, like someone who finally realized the ground beneath their feet wasn't theirs anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was strange and quiet and satisfying in a way that made me uneasy, because I knew I had finally done something they couldn't ignore, and they were on the outside looking in. And I wasn't going to let them in, not yet. Maybe not ever, because pride offered too late tastes a lot like pity, and I wasn't hungry for either. There's something unsettling about how quiet a house can feel the day after your life changes, especially when no one who should care has made the effort to be physically present to witness the transformation you've spent years bleeding for. The light came in soft through the curtains, casting a golden tint across the edges of my diploma, which still sat untouched in its stiff leather case, as if I were too afraid to take it out and risk dulling the glow of the only applause I had earned entirely on my own. I moved slowly that morning, not because I was tired, but because there was an unfamiliar weight in my chest. Not heavy like grief, but dense, like a sense of consequence finally settling in, as if every step I took was now being traced, followed, evaluated by a world that had decided I was worth watching. I didn't respond to any messages. The 37 missed calls were joined by a flood of texts, most of them from people I hadn't heard from in months, some even years, their words soaked in sudden admiration and a strange kind of guilt-drenched awe that made me uneasy. There were college acquaintances claiming to have always believed in me, relatives trying to schedule Zoom calls, and even a few old high school teachers tagging me in Facebook posts about never underestimating the quiet kids. I watched the attention build like a slow spiraling storm, and yet through all of it, the only voice I wanted to hear, my own, was buried beneath a mountain of half apologies and unsolicited validation. It was late afternoon when Kayla returned with takeout and a bottle of wine, her energy buzzing with equal parts pride and agitation, which she tried to mask behind a barrage of sarcasm and increasingly terrible jokes. She was the kind of friend who didn't ask for explanations, didn't press for tears, didn't try to fix what she knew she couldn't reach. She just sat across from me, poured the wine into mismatched mugs, and waited until I was ready to speak. I told her about the voicemail. I didn't cry. She didn't tell me what to do. We just sat there, 2 women surrounded by plastic containers and unopened congratulations cards from department faculty, knowing full well that the real conflict hadn't even started yet. It was during our second round of wine, cheap and warm and just bitter enough, that she asked the question I'd been trying not to think about. Are you going to talk to them? And I didn't answer right away because answering would have meant acknowledging a part of me still wanted something from them. An explanation, a confession, maybe even an apology that sounded like it cost them something to say. But what I told her, after a long silence, was the truest thing I'd said all day. They didn't deserve a seat in that auditorium. They didn't deserve a front row to a victory they never believed I would have. They didn't earn the right to celebrate what they refused to see being built. She nodded like she understood, and I think she did. There's a kind of quiet rage that only comes from being invisible for too long, a fire that burns low and steady, fueled not by vengeance, but by the need to finally claim something, anything, that no one else can touch or cheapen with their sudden interest. And mine had been burning for years. I remembered all of it then, not as isolated moments, but as a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. The birthday dinners I cooked for myself, while Kyle's came with balloons and steak. The missed parent-teacher nights they chalked up to scheduling conflicts. The scholarships I forwarded via email and never heard back about. The way my mother once told me I was too intense when I mentioned publishing my second academic paper before I turned 22. Even now, I could hear her voice in that voicemail, wavering but still clinging to that tone of carefully crafted maternal concern. The one that said, "We love you," but always came with a comma, never a period. It was late, nearly midnight, when the knock came. Not a hard one, not urgent or aggressive, but soft, too soft. The kind of knock that knows it doesn't belong on your door, but comes anyway, hoping you'll pretend not to notice the nerve it took to show up uninvited. I opened it slowly and saw both of them. My mother in her signature tan coat, face painted in an expression I couldn't quite name, and my father behind her, hands shoved into his pockets, his jaw tight, as if the whole thing was some corporate meeting he wasn't fully briefed on. For a moment, none of us said anything, and the air between us stretched thin, held together only by the silence of too many things left unsaid for too many years. My mother spoke first, because of course she did. "Ellie, sweetheart, we just wanted to see you, to say how proud we are." But I cut her off, not with words, but by stepping aside without letting them in. I didn't move. I didn't invite them to sit. I just let them stand in the entryway, hovering between the world they thought they understood and the one I had built without their hands. "We didn't know," she said again, and this time I responded. Not with anger, not with tears, but with the kind of tired clarity that only comes after you stop hoping someone will change. "You didn't want to know. You knew enough to choose Kyle's tournament over my graduation. You knew what that morning meant, and you still didn't show up." My father spoke then, finally, his voice lower, a little rough. "You should have told us it was that big of a deal." And that, more than anything else, made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly them. Always blaming the absence on the fact that I didn't wave enough, didn't shout loudly enough to be noticed over the noise of their lives. As if my job was to make myself so loud that neglect became impossible. I didn't invite them in, I didn't hug them. I didn't tell them it was okay. I told them to go home. You can't be late to a moment and expect it to wait for you. You missed it. That's not something you get to fix with a hug and a photo. And I closed the door before they could respond, their silence folding neatly behind it. The next morning, I woke up to another wave of missed calls and a new email sitting at the top of my inbox. Subject line, "Invitation to speak at TEDx." No explanation, no details yet. Just a line that read, "We were moved by your story. We'd love to have you share it with the world." And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to prove them wrong, but because I finally realized I didn't need their applause to be heard. There's a moment, usually sometime after the anger has simmered down and the calls have stopped flooding in, when silence turns into something less like peace and more like preparation, like the calm right before a building implodes, where everything feels too still, too composed, as if life itself is bracing for a collision that hasn't arrived yet, but is moving steadily toward you with quiet inevitability. I wasn't afraid of my parents anymore. That part of me had long since died and dried up somewhere between my 16th birthday and my first published research paper. But what I did fear, what I hadn't yet figured out how to deal with, was what came next after you finally stopped hoping the people who raised you might change into someone capable of seeing you as more than a footnote in their favorite child's life story. For days, I didn't answer. I didn't text them back. I didn't call. I didn't engage with the 20 different people telling me I should at least hear them out. I spent my hours writing, reading, rewatching the moment they filmed me on stage. Not for vanity, but to remind myself that I had done it, really done it, and that no amount of retroactive affection from the wrong people could rewrite the fact that I crossed that stage alone. And I still came out stronger. I answered interview requests. I cleaned my apartment. I bought a new blazer for the TEDx invitation I hadn't told anyone about yet, because somehow I knew if I spoke it aloud too soon, I'd let someone, maybe even myself, try to shrink it before it could fully bloom. It was a Wednesday afternoon when they showed up again, unannounced, uninvited, and of course, dressed like they were coming from something important. My mother in her neutral-toned business casual, carefully applied makeup, and that same tired, rehearsed look of concern, stretched across her face, the one she always wore when trying to look soft instead of controlling. My father, quieter this time, holding what looked like a bag from the local bakery, as if almond croissants and overpriced coffee could patch over decades of emotional neglect. I didn't open the door right away. I watched them from the peephole for a full minute, trying to determine whether they were there for me or for the version of me that had suddenly become interesting enough to be acknowledged in front of other people. When I finally let them in, I didn't step aside to make room for comfort. I simply moved far enough for them to enter on their own terms, knowing full well they hadn't earned a welcome, only an audience. My mother wasted no time. She launched into a monologue so packed with emotion and curated self-awareness that it could have passed for a TEDx audition itself. Apologies drenched in selective memory. Phrases like, "We didn't realize," "We thought we were doing what was best," and "We were just trying to support both our kids." As if splitting affection unevenly and dismissing every milestone I'd achieved was somehow a noble act of parenting under pressure. She kept talking, kept trying to pile words into something that resembled accountability, but sounded more like panic dressed up in empathy. My father, ever the quiet one, nodded along, offering a few fragmented phrases that were meant to ground her performance, but only highlighted how detached he remained. "We just didn't know it was such a big deal," he said again, repeating the same line from their last visit like he believed it absolved them from having to understand why it mattered at all. And maybe that's what finally broke the dam. Not the apology itself, but the way they tried to fit my life, my success, my hurt, into their existing framework of reason, never acknowledging that their absence wasn't a misunderstanding, but a pattern, a legacy of neglect, that I had spent years suffocating beneath until I clawed my way out of it with nothing but spite and academic ambition. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse them of anything. I simply asked a question that had haunted me for longer than I cared to admit. When Kyle was winning trophies for sports I couldn't even pronounce, you canceled work, you traveled, you cheered. When I was quietly collecting scholarships, earning degrees, working harder than I even knew I was capable of, what was I supposed to do to make you see me? They didn't answer, because they couldn't, because deep down, they knew the answer wasn't about what I failed to do. It was about what they refused to see. When they left, my mother tried to hug me. She reached out with a trembling arm and a strained smile, and for a split second, I considered leaning in, letting her pretend for a moment that we were something like healed, but I didn't. I stepped back. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Love that only shows up after the camera turns on isn't love. It's damage control." And just like that, they were gone again. This time without raised voices or slammed doors or angry accusations. Just silence, heavy and thick, like a curtain dropping on a show that ended long before the audience realized it was over. 2 days later, the TEDx team sent me the official announcement. My name, listed as a keynote speaker. The title of my talk, "The Ones Who Never Show Up, What We Learn When No One's Watching." The irony wasn't lost on me. I sent the flyer to Kayla. I didn't send it to my parents. The clip from my graduation had now passed 2 million views, And I was getting messages from students, from strangers, from adults who were twice my age, all saying the same thing in different words. Thank you for telling the story I've never had the courage to say out loud. Some of them told me they cried when they saw me walk alone. Some of them told me they recognized that look on my face because they had worn it once too. And every single one of them made me feel less like I had been abandoned and more like I had stepped into something bigger than just a degree. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity, and now that I had it, I didn't need them to explain themselves. I just needed them to understand that they could no longer write themselves into a chapter they didn't bother to show up for. The morning of the TEDx talk arrived with a kind of deliberate slowness. The sky outside a soft gray, not quite stormy, but not welcoming either, as if the weather, too, had decided to remain undecided, mirroring the weight of uncertainty I'd been carrying in my chest for weeks. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the lapel of my dark blazer for the 4th or 5th time, not out of vanity, but because this wasn't just another presentation. It wasn't a panel or a defense or an academic discussion that could be hidden behind jargon and data. This was something altogether more personal. Raw in a way I hadn't let myself be in public before, and no amount of dry run rehearsals or practiced poise could make it feel any less exposing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just speaking to earn a grade, a publication, or a reference. I was speaking because I had something to say that wasn't going to be ignored anymore, something that deserved to echo beyond the walls that once tried to contain it. Kayla drove me to the venue, her usual loud, distracting playlist toned down to something instrumental, like she understood without asking that today required space, not sound. She didn't ask how I was feeling, and I was grateful, because the truth is, I didn't know. I was a cocktail of nerves and calm, anger and gratitude, a tangled net of emotions I hadn't fully unpacked, all stitched together by the strange, steady pulse of knowing that this moment was mine, entirely mine, and no one could take it away from me. The auditorium filled slowly, rows of chairs, occupied by strangers, students, academics, and a smattering of local professionals whose interest had likely been piqued more by the viral video than by the topic itself. I scanned the crowd once, casually, with no intention of looking for familiar faces, but caught myself when I did it anyway, because no matter how much growth, no matter how many achievements or applause you collect, a part of you still wonders, still hopes, still aches for the impossible. And then I saw them, my parents, seated near the back, not in the center or the front row where they would have been visible in every photograph, but tucked off to the side, as if they weren't sure they had the right to sit any closer, as if they were testing the water before deciding to wade in. My mother's posture was stiff, composed but clearly uncomfortable, her lips pressed in a thin line that couldn't quite decide between a smile and silence. My father looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not physically, but like someone who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what had been lost, and how little control he had over reclaiming it. I didn't react, I didn't wave, didn't acknowledge them, didn't even let my expression flicker. I turned away and took the stage when they called my name, letting the applause settle into the background like static, letting my breath even out in the seconds before the microphone came alive. And when I finally spoke, I didn't speak with bitterness or fire. I spoke with the cool, unwavering conviction of someone who had carried pain long enough to know it didn't need to be shouted to be heard. I told the truth. I told them about growing up in a house where love came in uneven doses, where visibility was a currency you had to earn by being louder, more charming, less complicated. I told them what it meant to be the quiet one, the responsible one, the girl who learned that success was her only form of currency. And even then, it was often spent before she got to hold it. I spoke of missed birthdays, ignored phone calls, the slow, steady realization that applause wasn't going to come from the people I most wanted it from, and the decision I made to walk that stage alone, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Because you can't force people to see you when they've decided you're just the background to someone else's spotlight. And then I told them about the calls, the 37 missed calls, how each one came not because they had suddenly realized they missed me, but because they missed the moment. They missed the public celebration of something they didn't help build, and they couldn't stand not being part of a story that was finally being told. Without them, I never said their names, I never pointed a finger, but I saw the shift in the crowd, the nods, the tears, the quiet gasps of recognition from people who had lived the same story with different details. I felt it, down to my bones, that this wasn't just my moment anymore. This was for every person who had ever been the afterthought in their own family, for every child who was told they were too serious, too much, or simply not enough. This was a reclamation. When the talk ended, the standing ovation came slowly at first, like people weren't sure whether to clap or reflect. But then it swelled, real and warm and loud in a way that filled my lungs like breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I left the stage without looking back, walking down the side hallway with Kayla waiting near the exit, her arms folded, her eyes damp. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. And then I checked my phone. There they were again. 37 missed calls, not from just my parents this time, but from publishers, producers, journalists, people with blue check marks and network affiliations, people who wanted to talk, to feature, to share. But buried in the list, tucked between them like ghosts refusing to disappear, were my mother and father. Again, 37, as if the number had become symbolic, as if they thought repeating it might undo the damage, might mean something different this time. But it didn't. I walked out into the bright, unforgiving afternoon light, the doors of the auditorium closing behind me with a quiet thud. Not dramatic, just final. And in that moment, for the first time, I wasn't looking for them. I wasn't checking for their approval, their praise, their permission to be proud. They had been too little, too late. And now I was too far gone.